Welcome to the 9th season of the Summer Solstice series at First Presbyterian Church, Salina, Kansas. Hello, I'm Martha Ray. I'm co-coordinator with Sydney Soderberg of the Summer Solstice series. And in planning the 2020 programs, we knew that we couldn't ignore our current time of disruption and uncertainty. You know, in the midst of so much confusion, we took the opportunity to bring together the best local and national minds in a virtual format to explore this year's theme, the edges of new community. Today is the third and final in the series, and it's titled, Are You Listening? A Dialogue. The panel members are Wes Jackson, Emeritus President and co-founder of the Land Institute, Burdett Loomis, Emeritus Professor of Political Science at the University of Kansas, Maureen Morrison, Clinical Psychologist in private practice in Wichita, Kansas, and Kathleen Sebelius, former Governor of the state of Kansas and Secretary of Health and Human Services in the Obama administration. The panel is moderated by Gerald Gillespie, Emeritus Professor of Psychology at Kansas Wesleyan University. And a reminder, the edges of new community is by definition exploring stretchy thinking, moving into new territory that might just take us out of our comfort zones. We certainly don't ask you to agree with everything, and in fact, it's okay to really disagree. But please do listen. And as with all of the Summer Solstice series, the views expressed by the participants are their own and not those of the church. Finally, remember that this program and the entire series can be viewed at this location at any time. And please invite others to join us. And now, Professor Gillespie.
Welcome, everyone, to this third and final panel presentation of our 2020 Solstice series. This last panel is entitled, Are We Listening Now? A Dialogue. We will be reconsidering the themes of our previous two panels. One was on the losses, grief, and resulting and trauma, that results from this COVID pandemic. And the other one was on possibilities in hope and hope in possibilities. I'm going to begin with a question to each of our panelists and then follow on with some questions before inviting discussion from them and also incorporating some of the viewer questions we have received from the last couple panels. So, are we really listening to what this pandemic is saying about us and to us? Are we listening? We have a very distinguished group of panelists today who've generously agreed to share their time with us. Governor Kathleen Sebelius, Wes Jackson, Burdett Loomis, and Maureen Morrison. So I want to thank all of you here. I will thank you again, I'm sure, later on. From each of you, there is a world of observations and reflections and recommendations that you can share with us, but also task us with to be doing. So I want to get right into our dialogue today by asking a first question, if I could, of Maureen, who is a clinical psychologist. Maureen, with your own experience as a psychologist, could you explain to us some of the emotional tools that each of us needs to make our way through this rather difficult time of COVID? And how do we mitigate the stress, the anxiety, the challenges that I think many of us are feeling through this? And maybe a part of that same question is, how can we help each other through this process as well?
Well, thank you, Professor Gillespie. It's a pleasure to be invited to spend this time with all of you and to explore this unprecedented period that we are living through together. I would like to continue the conversation started by Dr. Freed in the first panel regarding the essential importance of our individual and collective narratives. Grief has always been a difficult emotion in America. We are a culture fixated on happiness and avoiding pain. But COVID-19 has highlighted the suffering when grief has nowhere to go. Our reality right now is that the public good necessitates limiting companionship and connection, and that those things happen to be the very best medicine that we have for soothing grief. But in spite of this dire situation, there is some encouraging research. Dr. George Bonanno, a psychology professor who's researched grief for years at Columbia, he reports confidently that the vast majority of people, probably about 90%, will come to terms with what has been taken from them, and they will adapt to the loss sooner rather than later. Unfortunately, he also acknowledges the other 10% may not get over the loss for at least 2 to 3 years. But he suggests that if we are listening to ourselves, grief gives us the job or the command to slow down, to turn inward, and to recalibrate living in a world without whatever we have lost. He suggests that sadness seems to slow the outer world down, and it actually sharpens our cognitive capacity. There is research demonstrating that sadness actually makes our appraisal of the world and ourselves more accurate than usual. And this process is exactly what I have seen people sharing with me during the therapy hour over the last few months. They have been using this enforced slowdown to reassess their stories. They are recalibrating because of the losses, and they are beginning to look forward to the future. For many years, I've encouraged my patients dealing with grief or loss to take the time to write out a lament. Just like in the book of Lamentations in the Bible, the goal is to get it out and get it described. Get out the feelings and the fears caused by the loss. And then I encourage them to share that with someone, either myself or a trusted loved one, or to God if that is a part of their worldview. Dr. Kurt Thompson takes it a step further. He is a psychiatrist who has written a great deal about how shame infects our narratives. And he also relies a great deal and cites Dr. Dan Siegel's work regarding neuroplasticity. He recommends at the end of each day that you take time to handwrite a brief lament. Don't do it on a tablet, don't do it on your computer, but to handwrite a brief lament about what has been hard about your day and how you feel about it. But then also list at least 3 things that day offered to you that you are grateful for. Then the next step is plan to share that with 1 or more people the next day. Our work is to lament what we have lost, but also to pay attention to what has brought us joy, pleasure, or connection. So the beginning of our work is to listen to ourselves. Sharing that journal or what you've written down leads to coping skill number 2. Be intentional about connecting with at least 2 or 3 other people that you love each day. Stay away from complaining, blaming others about how the pandemic is going or politics. Instead, inquire how they are feeling. Keep it on the feeling level. And also be sure to tell them how you are feeling as well. We give others a sense of purpose by giving them the opportunity to comfort us. This pandemic has stirred up our deepest fears about death and being left by others. Connecting for even a short time, but with true intimacy, makes us feel seen and heard and is a powerful antidote to this fear of abandonment. Dr. Dan Siegel reminds us that our need for attachment is about being seen and soothed so that we feel safe and secure. Another suggestion would be to consider limiting the amount of news you consume. At a certain point, it feeds anxiety rather than provides answers. I would suggest read good literature instead, or engage in some creative pursuits. Refrain from social media scrolling. It adds to our distractibility and our anxiety, and the time could be used to authentically connect. I also recommend trying to spend some time each day doing something creative or artistic. And I'm not talking about, painting a Mona Lisa. I have patients reporting playing more games with their family members, learning a new language online, or starting music lessons. Do you remember in the first couple months of the pandemic, there was a shortage of baker's yeast? People were wisely getting creative with flour, water, and yeast. And the process of creating bread, the sense of mastery when you pulled it from the oven, and the pleasure when sharing it with others creates resilience. It does wonderful things for our neurotransmitters and synapses in our brain. My big creative endeavor was to make new file folders that were pretty. I wanted a project that was very simple that I could spend 10 to 15 minutes a day on, and I developed new skills with sharp, small knives. But this then led to getting papers organized, and I enjoyed the beauty of my work, and it made me happy and brought a smile to my face. Obviously, take extra good care of your body with enough sleep, healthy food, and find ways to move your body that are simple and accessible. Your body is an essential pillar for emotional resilience. My experience as a psychologist has taught me that humans are incredibly adaptive and resilient. In the last several months, I have been in awe and I've been privileged to sit with people from all walks of life as they have shared with me the creative, unique, and generous solutions they have devised to keep their businesses afloat, their families together, and their communities connected. For all of us, we have a choice to make multiple times a day about how this pandemic will define who we are and how we choose to respond. We are meaning makers. We become what we pay attention to over and over again. Obviously, there are many things about this situation that humans cannot predict or control, but how we choose to respond is one of our greatest tools in creating our narrative as a person and as a people. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Maureen. And we'll go from this more personal to a much bigger perspective, because it was Wes Jackson who's, I think, well known for saying that where most of us are not thinking big enough, and that that means we should be investing our lives on projects that we will not see the conclusion of. So my question to Wes is, what do Kansans most need to be working on now? Projects, efforts that we may not complete in our lifetime, but that show we are listening to the deeper messaging that's coming from the coronavirus. At the same time, with the complexities of environmental degradation and climate change facing us, what is at least one important practical thing you'd suggest that each of us can do now to help move toward a future that will meaningfully sustain us? Thank you, Wes, for being here.
Well, thank you, Gary, and everybody involved in putting this together. The need to work on problems of distancing, which include, I think, returning to small towns and rural communities in Kansas. In 1977, Wendell Berry's book, The Unsettling of America, came out. And his intention was that we could put ourselves on a corrective course. And the dual meaning of that word unsettling, I think in our time has become clear. He meant for it to be corrective, and it ended up being prophetic. Unsettling so many different ways. We had various administrations saying such things to farmers as get big or get out, or plant fence row to fence row. And as a consequence, in that period of time, which began, well, there are a lot of places you can begin, but let's say right after World War II. I mean, I was born on a farm in which there were horses, and the tractor came when I was a kid during World War II, and the horses were gone. And with the loss of the horses came a loss of certain cultural capacity for living on contemporary sunlight and the production of our food and fiber. people laugh about that as being no big deal, because look at all the advantages that came later. I was raised on a farm in the Kansas River Valley near Topeka, and to this day, there are my muscles and my mind move toward the kind of patterns that were at work in that world, and they're somewhat hard to teach. Now, the other, I don't know, a month or two ago, I checked to see how many of the small towns in Saline County, Kansas, had a post office. Well, of the some 16 or 17, depends on how you want to count it, towns, there are now 4. And there is still this great exodus. Now, this is odd, given that humans are land-based as a species, and our cultural capacities go all the way back to the beginning of agriculture, going through a Bronze Age 5,000 years later. So 10,000 years ago, we became a species out of context, and we've been struggling ever since, because we were over 200,000 years, we became gatherers and hunters. No one's arguing now that we become gatherers and hunters, but what we know is that we're hardwired for a life of membership within a community, hardwired to be connected to land as a source, hardwired to small scale, and this living a species out of context, particularly in big cities, I think leads to a lot of our emotional problems, and to the problems of climate change. So I can't resist telling something I put together here, I don't know, a couple of months ago, reading Lao Tzu, and Lao Tzu telling about living in the village. Now we're talking about like 400 to 600 BC. That's a long time ago. And Lao Tzu tells about living in that village where he heard the rooster crow every morning, but he had never been to that village. And then I remembered some of the lines of the Tao Te Ching. Ex-Methodists still know how to get back into other religions. But in the Tao Te Ching, it goes something like this: Tao rules heaven, heaven rules earth, earth rules humanity. Humanity lost the way when we began to substitute our designs for nature's designs. And then if we're to build, you build in auspicious places in order to, and here comes the line that I can't find, but I remember it from, I don't know, 400 years ago. Something like this: in order to be in harmony with the local eddies of the cosmic breath, this is what you do in order to have an auspicious setting. And I thought of that rooster that crowed, and that the man had never been to the village where it crowed. Now, was this distancing? Was this the consequence of some kind of acknowledgement that don't go running around all over the place? So as a matter of a practical necessity, this becomes encoded in the religious language, local eddies of cosmic breath. So I don't know if that's exactly what was going on, but it's very interesting that that distancing was there in the first place. These viruses are much older than humans. The viruses probably go back like 3.45 billion years ago, very fast after the journey from minerals to cells and Darwinian evolution. So what do I propose? I propose that we began a campaign, kind of like recruiters for sports, And we got to get our act together on this. But we go to the East Coast and the West Coast, and we say, just in Saline County alone, we have, let's say, 17 communities. And come back and begin to develop real security by learning how to grow food. Now you say, well, you got to buy the land, you got to do this, that, and the other. Yeah, there's all of that that has to be dealt with. But also we need to remember how fast we left the land, how fast we left our small towns and rural communities, and begin to lose our cultural capacity. So food, shelter, clothing, formerly all came from the land. And this is in the interest of climate change. Climate change sums this whole problem best. I mean, we have a chance now to look under that reality of climate change and see all of the factors that are contributing to the carbon. So I'm saying some things pretty radical now. I think we need to acknowledge that we're not going to solve this problem of climate change simply by trying to live according to some moral code. We better acknowledge that we've got to put a cap on carbon, and then begin to tighten that cap. And then there will be, as a derivative, ways of doing in the world. Now, we can take everything with us we've picked up during this time. We can, am I supposed to quit now?
Yeah, pretty soon. Yeah.
Okay, well, senile rapture, you know, has its own way.
I
So I think that what we can do now is begin to think about a return and a new Homestead Act in a way, because right now it's chemical contamination of the land and water, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, a derivative of corn and soybeans, and the chemicals that are put on it. The dead zone, we've got the evidence. Now we know what to do.
Okay. Well, thank you, Wes. Let's try to move from those local eddies to the national breath or the cosmic breath or whatever here, and transition to Governor Sebelius here. I'd like to ask you, Governor, if the visionary spirit of America is in fact to strive for those ideals of basic human rights and providing for the common good and the necessary human safety needs and the kind of supports that's implied in what Wes was saying as well here, and also flatten the curve of long-standing embedded social injustices, where does this COVID-19 crisis point our country, point our ship of state? What are some new practical benchmarks for progress in all these areas that we really need to set, and that will, if possible, tie into what Wes is saying about re-inhabiting our place?
Well, thank you, Professor Gillespie, for inviting us today. I'm thrilled to be with this distinguished panel and have an opportunity to talk about everything from Lao Tzu to personal journeys. I think the connections, the dots are interesting, certainly. I would sort of start where Wes left off a little bit, right here in Kansas, right in the middle of this country, and with our state motto, to the stars through difficulty. And there's no question that this is an enormously challenging time for our state and our country, and frankly, for the world. We have three overlapping simultaneous crises that have really shined a bright light on some very important and troubling gaps in our societal pact with one another. We have an enormous health crises and demonstrating very clearly that America continues to have huge gaps in access to healthcare, in disparities, in social determinants impacting people's health. We have an enormous economic crisis where roughly 15 million people are now without work, and people are struggling to pay their rent and live in their houses and buy food, and very uncertain about the future for themselves and their children. And we have the simmering racial crisis, which often is just below the surface, now at the surface and very visible. And there was no, unfortunately, clear demonstration than having a police officer kneel on the neck of George Floyd for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, and people could watch real time what that means. I can't breathe is very symbolic, I think, to race relations in this country. I think that we also, for the first time in a long time, maybe in my lifetime, have to be very humble about our challenges as a country. We are doing worse in lots of ways in dealing with these various crises than most developed countries and many undeveloped countries. We are still having debates within our own society. Do we believe in science or not? I mean, Wes talks about returning to roots. You talk about, the question was framed of what next steps are. And I think part of it is a humility about America that often is not part of our character, but needs to be part of our character in the future. And I think we have a crisis that has revealed big gaps in the system, where we have a country where value is often measured by wealth, not by talent or capabilities, and access to public service is not part of our social contract the way it is with countries around the world. Just because you live in the United States, you do not have an expectation for certain things. We know now with a very clear light, lots of things that have been written about and talked about for a long time, that health disparities do impact illness, that your geography often determines not only life expectancy, but educational attainment. We know that the so-called essential workers in our society are not paid as if they are the most essential people in our society, and that social determinants, where you live, the air you breathe, the water you drink, really does impact your health. And those have been written about and talked about, but I don't know that all of America can see that the way they can today with COVID ravaging communities, but particularly ravaging communities of color and lower income communities. So in terms of where we go from here, there's going to be a lot of discussion about programs and policies, which is good. But I think we actually have to have a more fundamental discussion with one another as a society. Do we believe, as Americans, that healthcare is right? And if so, we need to act on that. Do we take very seriously, for the first time in every part of this country, that we have a systemically racist system and economic system and education system and health system? And if so, we then build programs and policies. Do we believe that we are all involved in this democracy, that we think the public good is more important than the individual good? I think those fundamental compacts with one another have to be reasserted. And to me, there are three kind of practical benchmarks of whether we're making progress. Are we willing to step up very quickly and pay everyone in America who works a living wage? We don't do that now. That is sort of an essential deal that we make. If you work, you should be able to feed and take care of your family and live with some measure of dignity. Do we believe that leave from work should be paid and is important? Parents should not have to choose any longer between being parents and workers, that workers who are ill should be able to stay home and find health care and not fear losing their jobs. Again, we're one of the only developed countries that doesn't have a system where not only work is valued and paid for, but leave is valued and paid for and is important to the life cycle. And finally, are we really willing to, I think, invest in some early childhood education the way other nations have invested? Because that system where we value children not by word but by investing in them, we value parents by investing in their ability to be both good parents and good workers. We understand that health is no longer just something that takes place in a doctor's office. It's a national security issue. We have seen this country basically brought to its knees because we cannot deal effectively with a health crisis. And that has produced a series of domino effects. And that realization, the humility about the gaps that exist in America that don't exist around the world, and then resolving to fix them, I think gives us a clear path forward. But we shoot for the stars, but we got a lot of difficult and turbulent times to get there, but I still think it's quite possible. And there's no better place to see the stars than right here in Kansas.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Governor. I'm sure we'll come back to some of the points you've made here too as well. And I think it may be a natural transition to Burdette Loomis. You have been an editorial voice and a critic in Kansas, but someone who builds arguments around practicality and on political values that are inclusive of all of us, Kansas, and which strive to, in fact, try to move Kansas forward together. So we are strong and resilient, as Governor emphasized here, but the times look to be difficult, and you may want to add on to some things you've heard or go in some other directions. But what are the kind of challenges you're seeing we have to look at that we're not paying enough attention to, perhaps, and that we need to resolve in order to make this COVID crisis one that we can say help turn us in a good direction? Thank you, Burdette, for being here. Appreciate that.
Thank you, Professor Gillespie, and thanks to everybody else. It's great to see you guys. I don't know, I've got my notes here. I feel a little mundane, not going back to the Bronze Age, but I think that to pick on what Kathleen has talked about as aspiring to the stars, I think one of the great things coming to Kansas now 41 years ago was to see, as a political scientist and particularly a legislative scholar, how one Kansas expressed itself in a whole variety of ways, and particularly within the legislative process and the policymaking process in Kansas. Kansas came out of a divisive era. The most divisive era in American history was forged in the run-up to the Civil War. And we all know that background. But in that forging, I think we've been pretty successful at thinking of ourselves as one state, even though with vast land expanses here, there's a great diversity in Kansas. There always has been. There remains great diversity. And so the question is, can we learn from this pandemic, this existential crisis, and think about Kansas as a whole? It's not so much, I think that applies to the United States as well right now, of course. But if we're looking at Kansas, I think that despite a lot of divisions, rural-urban divisions, certainly different kinds of economic structures, manufacturing, farming, commercial structures in various parts of the state, we've really held together pretty well. And I really want to talk about the modern era of Kansas government, which I think emerged in the 1960s after a reapportionment decision that corrected the gross apportionment problems of the Kansas legislature. And over the last 50 years, that system of government that emerged, I think, has served Kansas very, very well. And honestly, the glue that has cemented as much as possible the idea of a whole Kansas has really been the three-party politics of Kansas. Republicans, both moderate and conservative, and Democrats. And this has been gone over a lot of times, but I don't think we understand how different Kansas is from even our neighbors. I was in Oklahoma a couple of years ago, and I was talking to the minority leader of the Oklahoma legislature, a Democrat, and I said, well, what about making coalitions with more moderate Republicans? And he looked at me as if I was talking about Martians. There weren't any moderate Republicans. I think there were some very responsible conservatives, but there was no one in the Republican Party that could have been clearly seen as a moderate. Kansas has had those people across the state for its history, but particularly over the last 50 years. And that's meant that doesn't mean that we haven't had big fights. We have big fights all the time. We had them in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s. No question. But those fights could be resolved through the political process in many ways, often with moderate Republicans serving as kind of a focal point to come together to build different kinds of majorities and different kinds of circumstances. Now that became more problematic in the early 2000s, as Governor Sebelius, I think, can attest to, and it really became more problematic after 2010 with the election of Sam Brownback. The elections of 2016 and 2018 have moved that pendulum back somewhat. But I think what we're seeing in Kansas is really the disappearance of moderate Republicans. The most recent primary elections have demonstrated that in the Republican Party right now, there's a tremendous preference for, I would say, far-right Republicans. I'm loath to use the term conservatives because I don't think many of them are conservatives. Far-right Republicans win these primaries, defeating some really wonderful legislators, John Scoobel, for example, in Johnson County. And so that opens up an opportunity for Democrats. And Democrats are going to win some of those seats, maybe quite a few of those seats that have pushed so far to the right with Republicans. But at the end of the day, that's going to mean that you're going to have Democrats and then many Republicans who are loath to compromise. There's still some moderates, there's still some people in the middle, but we're beginning to look more and more like national politics, which means that the dialogue and the ultimate compromises are harder to come by and more fraught with divisive language. My hope would be that the pandemic would get people to think more broadly, as Kathleen has talked about, to talk about the common good. I think so far I'm not optimistic about that coming to pass. We'll have to see what happens in the election and the legislative session. But the rhetoric so far has not been, to me, very encouraging. The whole divisiveness on wearing masks as a political statement has been highly problematic. So, and what strikes me is that to look back, we see this Kansas that has struggled in various ways, had its political divisions, but found ways to come together. And I think in a very responsive, representative way, kind of moderate conservative government, which is, I think, what the state historically has been. Going forward, I see somewhat less hope for that. And I would hope that the pandemic, as it winds down, we can see that the state as a whole needs to come together, and we can talk more about where those policies might be, but certainly in public health, a new approach to education, public service, you name it. But so far, I think the jury is still out on whether we can do that.
Thank you, Burdette. Lots of topics here to talk about. I'd like to just go back, if I could, to the governor, partly for selfish reasons, but I think because you can address as your experience with Secretary of Health and Human Services, the pandemic in some other ways. But I'm a new grandparent, and I know there are others out there, and I'm wondering if and when I'll be able to see and hold her. And I think a lot of family members aren't able to be with their loved ones who are sick, many who are dying. We hear nightmarish stories about that distancing here. And parents now are really torn about choices they have to make about sending their kids to school. And I appreciate not being in that situation right now myself, to have to make those choices. But given the present state of the pandemic that you see in the country right now, and with the experience you have, Governor, and I understand a new grandparent yourself, what do you believe must happen to make us safe and able to at least connect more physically and socially with one another on these important human life experiences? And then we'll move.
Yeah, I think this ties back into some of the things that Maureen started us on. This is a very personal situation, and loss, as you have described it, I mean, the loss of being able to embrace a new grandchild and to hop on a plane or, you know, drive in a car and go visit a brand new is just heartbreaking. And more heartbreaking, I think, is to watch people try and deal with the isolation of a loved one who may be in a nursing home, who now they can't physically visit and often is confused. I have that situation in my own family where my aunt can't figure out why people are not coming to see her anymore and has a hard time hearing on the telephone or working on an iPad, even though the staff try to set it up. It's not the same. I haven't seen my 3 grandsons outside of Boston since the end of February. And that is absolutely heartbreaking. They're not great on FaceTime. You know, you can see a streaking body, sometimes clothed, sometimes unclothed, going by, but, you know, they're not great sitting down and having a conversation. And I'm dying to see them. We are lucky in that our 12-week-old granddaughter is here in Lawrence. We have been part of her family pod since they were pregnant, and so I have been able to see her and hold her, initially masked. Now the pediatrician has said it's okay after 10 weeks to take a mask off, so I can finally you know, smile at her and she can know that I'm smiling at her. And that has been just, that physical connection has been incredibly helpful to me. Mm-hmm. But I think that we are at a point where most public is doing, I think, a really important thing in this country. First of all, they are choosing health over the economy, and they are listening to the health leaders and not necessarily the Chamber of Commerce or political leaders who say, you got to get back to work, you got to open up. They are saying, we want to be safe and secure, and trying to listen carefully to what's going on in their neighborhoods, in their homes. I can't imagine. Both of my sons are married, both have children. The 12-week-old wasn't going to school, but my older son has 3 little boys who are dying. 2 of the 3 are dying to be in school, and they miss school and they miss their friends. But I watch them struggle with how to work at home, and both my son and daughter-in-law are working at home, how to keep the kids connected, how to keep them engaged socially. That's a very, as you say, challenging issue. But they are choosing safety and security over socialization. They have a lot of resources to make up the difference. I weep for the children who aren't surrounded by 2 parents and lots of access to tools and techniques and food. I think we really, one of the most desperate things about school opening and not opening is we have had children literally starving since March because they are reliant on school programs for breakfast, lunch, often backpacks home in the summer, and massive feeding programs that typically go on all throughout the year. Kansas has done a pretty good job in that during the school year, and we found over the years a lot of summertime partners that had big feeding that all pretty well is ground to a halt. And I don't think we can minimize not just the safety and security of children, which is often enhanced getting out of their houses, but also the fact that they rely on school as a source of important food. And I think as a country, we absolutely have to fix that very quickly. If schools are not going to open in the area, we have to find a way to feed those kids very quickly, because we are really looking at a situation in the richest country in the world where we have children who are now starving because they cannot rely on a system of schools to actually provide those meals. But listening to public health officials, unfortunately, we are in the situation we're in. We don't have any models to follow anywhere else in the world because no one has done as badly as we have getting a handle on the disease. We know what success looks like. You drive the virus down to a very low level where it is not being transmitted. You have in place enough contact tracers to immediately respond to outbreaks, and then you identify and isolate and quarantine new cases. We know that's the key to opening safely, whether it's a business or a school or social settings. We have done none of the above. So I think what people are doing is saying over and over again, we want to keep our kids safe. We're not willing to put them on the front lines. I heard somebody the other day, I think it was a government official, God help us all, not in Kansas, luckily, but referring to children as Navy SEALs. They're going to go into these battles. He meant that's the way schools should open. I don't think my grandchildren should be Navy SEALs. I don't think I'm expendable, and I sure don't think they're expendable. So listening to public health, I mean, we know what to do. We know how to do it. And unfortunately, we don't seem to have the will in this country to continue anything for a long enough period of time that we achieve some success. In Kansas, we've done an okay job for a while, and now we have this mishmash of some people are following public health rules and some people aren't. We're unfortunately seeing what happens when you just don't listen to the common sense steps. But until we have an effective, safe vaccine that is distributed to at least 70 to 80% of the country, we are still going to be dealing with a raging virus. And I think we just have to take very practical steps of, if hotspots continue to occur, crank back down the activity, withdraw people from indoor close settings, wear masks, wash your hands. And as Wes said, everybody should get a piece of land in Salina and begin to plant a garden, because I do think that has a lot of benefits. Not just it keeps us more resilient, but it actually will do wonders for your health.
Since you've been talking about family and education, I'd like to go to Maureen first and then maybe to Wes on other dimensions of curriculum, if I could. But for Maureen, family systems and family therapy is an important field now. And I thought maybe you have some comments or some reflections about and for families that we should be giving particular attention to in order to help them meet some of the kind of challenges that the governor was also talking about as well. Do you want to add anything further to that?
Sure. I can just share just what I'm seeing and working with people. And absolutely, obviously, the family is foundational. And it's also I think it's one of our best weapons against fighting against the ill effects of the pandemic. During the pandemic, one of the things I've seen for a lot of people is that in addition to the normal roles in their family, they've added all of these different roles. So now parents are not just parents, they're also teachers. Spouses are no longer just spouses, they're co-workers, you know, and they're fighting over who has how much table space in the kitchen so they can do their work on their computer every day. And so the family system in some ways has gotten more complicated. And what I see in working with people is, and again, it sounds very simple, but it is so powerful, is the family systems that are being intentional about communicating with one another about these role changes and communicating about how it feels and what's working and not working. Those are the systems that are adapting, and they're actually becoming more flexible and more resilient. And they actually report an increased sense of connection and intimacy. The families that are not doing that, and sometimes it's because they may be overly focused on risk and feeling out of control, and they sort of feel hunkered down, and they're shutting down emotionally as individuals, and therefore not communicating with one another, even within the family. Those families are not doing so well. I do think that, unfortunately, we're also seeing more things. We're going to be seeing more things like child abuse. There have not been as many eyes on our children to notice and report concerns about neglect and abuse. As financial stressors increase, we know that that can be a driver of abuse within family systems. So those families that are at risk, I think we need to pour more resources into those situations.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I'd like to now go to one of the questions that was submitted by a viewer here and direct this to Wes because it's connected to, I know you've, in your own way, been very interested in education and curriculum and what's taught. And in the light of this reflective time of COVID, you know, what's important with climate change and the dramatic kind of things going on? And you're involved with the Ecospheric Studies program as well. So what do we need to know? I guess that's another important question, not just getting to school, but educating everyone for a future that is really not very clear. So I thought you might have a few comments to say about that, and then I'd like to go to Burdett.
Yeah. Well, I'm no longer a geneticist, and I'm pretty much nothing anymore, which gives me a great opportunity to run the risk of being a charlatan. But I set out to try to look at other emergencies that had occurred in our history. And I came up with the idea of the need to seize the opportunity of consequences, the opportunity that comes with negative, seemingly negative consequences. And there was the fire in London, wiped out 3/4 of London. Then there was a plague, actually a plague that knocked out 1/4 of the population. That's when Newton then went to his little town and gained the great insight of the universe and how things work. Those were, and we see then what happened from 1660s up until the beginning of the Industrial Revolution 100 years later. Opportunities, I think, come as a consequence of, it's like burning the prairie, keeping back the woody vegetation and sort of enhancing it, that you, this in a certain very limited sense, this may be what we need in order to slow us down and to think again about the problem of the growth economy and what the growth economy has done to our country. And so I'm looking at an opportunity that's a consequence of a tragedy. I was reading in Council of Higher Education or something, this is 4 or 5 years ago maybe, that by 2025, 40% of the small colleges are going to be bankrupt. So now what are we going to do with them? Turn them into minimum security prisons, as happened in Nebraska. Our own little Catholic college here, the Highway Patrol has come in to take, I don't object to the Highway Patrol having a place, but what are we going to do with all of those places? Well, maybe here is an opportunity to redo education in some ways in which we acknowledge the need for development of cultural capacity as land animals. And if we can do that, then we can occupy these various buildings. We can have young people begin to learn, develop the cultural capacity for our food supply. Otherwise, we're going to keep on with the industrialization of agriculture that has been so ruinous of our land and water and our communities. So that's a suggestion. Now, that's a big, tall order, but it's no bigger than the tall order that was put in by one administration after another to depopulate the countryside. And of course, it had the forces of capitalism to make it possible. This, I think, is our great turn, our great opportunity. We got to seize it and act on it in a serious way. And one of my concerns is that if once the virus goes away, we will decide we're going to return to normal better in that usual understanding of what better is, rather than ask the hard questions. Why should the governor have to be going all the way to Boston to be with her grandchildren? Why not the backyard of Topeka, or the backyard of Lyons, Kansas, or the backyard of somewhere else? Now, I'm not objecting to people going to Boston, but I've got the same problem. You know, a daughter up in Iowa, and you know, it's too far. So anyway, I have more to say, but
yeah. Well, let me, I'll open it up for a little bit of discussion, but I want to go to Burdett first, because I saw a recent article that you had written in which you quoted Winston Churchill in saying that we should never let a good crisis go to waste. And so you might have a way of adding to the opportunities that might be in this, you see in this crisis, but particularly as you look out on the panorama of Kansas and small towns and the economic and political problems, you might have something further to add on that, and then we'll see what other comments we have from the others here.
Sure, and this builds right back on what Wes was saying about these great disruptions, and certainly they're terrifically problematic, but they also do open up opportunities. I look further into that quote, and I guess Churchill said it or says something like it, but nobody knows quite where it came from. Rahm Emanuel stole it and put it to good use. But it's one of those that has a kind of indistinct origin. That doesn't make it any less true. And I do think, again, going back to something Wes said at the very beginning, that we're confronting this pandemic that goes back to viruses that have been around forever. It's something in nature that we are confronting. I'd say parenthetically, it's something that Trump is confronting, unlike anything else in his administration. He just has to confront these pretty horrific facts day in, day out. And it's extraordinarily problematic for him. I don't think he's taken the opportunity. He had a great opportunity, politically, policy-wise, that he has completely mangled. I'll leave it there on Trump. But as I look at the state, a whole variety of things pop into mind. And they may seem a little mundane, but I think they're really important in how we go forward. First of all, the whole question of authority. Who has authority to issue orders, things of that nature, the relationship between state government and cities and localities, home rule, as it's called. It's a jumble. Kathleen was talking about it before. There is no voice of authority. The governor's power was limited by the legislature. And that's it's kind of politics as normal bickering kind of politics that don't serve us well when we're facing a pandemic. So I think one of the things we really need to look at is how we address major issues like this and get it straight beforehand, because we're making it up as we go along, and it has not been to the benefit of Kansas. We're not as bad as Georgia or Florida or some of the other states, but we haven't been as good as we should have been. And again, we're not necessarily all pulling in the same direction. I think that this gives you an opportunity as we face budget crises. We're just starting to see those roll out, to look at the state and local level of what's really important. What are our priorities? And then we may have that review and come back and say, oh, they're pretty much the same as when we went into this. But for something like public health, if we don't learn about the necessity and the great advantage in having a strong public health service in the state of Kansas or nationally, then we haven't learned very much at all. The other thing comes down to education. I think that small colleges are going to fail. They're going to fail faster than they were originally anticipated to, as we're going to have a big downturn in enrollment around 2026. That has now been pushed up. I think we're never going to go back to full in-class universities. I think that distance learning has come, again, faster than we would have ever thought. I see it among my own colleagues. I'm really happy to be retired and not have to do Zoom classes. But in 6 months, the sophistication of my peers doing this has gotten way, way better by the force of the pandemic. So I think that distance learning is there. As Wes and Kathleen suggested, distance commerce is there. People are working from home. There are any number of people in Lawrence who are working distance. People have come back from the coast and living in Lawrence, doing their jobs. So I do think those opportunities to go back to Maureen's sense of how this is changing familiar relationships and stuff like that. I think those are all occurring. So there's an optimism in that we are resilient and that we are making these changes. What I'm worried about is, as was noted before, that we'll just at the end say, okay, we beat back that pandemic, let's go on. If we do that, then we will have failed in a whole variety of ways.
Thank you.
Can I leap in and tag on to something, Burdette? I'd like to take the lens out, just the aperture, open it up just a little bit more, because I think you raised three really central topics that I think we actually need to look at as a nation, and they certainly have great impact as a state. One is, just spending. What are we going to spend revenue on, how much revenue we collect, what we regard as important and not important. And it kind of goes back a little bit to the social contract I was talking about earlier. We have gotten into a system of government where spending is all about what the government spends in certain things, not what we collectively want to regard as priorities. So the fact that, you know, we don't pay for higher education, we don't pay for healthcare, we don't, through our tax system, the way lots have developed, we don't pay for leave, we don't, it's too expensive. And the question I think we need to start asking at the state and the federal level is, too expensive to whom? And what is the cost of not spending that? What is the cost of not doing that? What are the costs of these enormous gaps between those who have their own personal resources and those who don't? How does that leave us as a country in terms of resiliency and productivity and national security? I think the question of governance that Burdett again raised early on, we need to take to the national level. We have a framework that has been built on a system of checks and balances, and we're seeing act in real time, I would suggest. Parts of that system just refuse to be the check or balance, refuse to step up at the federal level. What happens? We have a leader who is undermining everything from the free press to the independent judiciary, tenets of our democracy, and having a basic conversation as a country about what this democracy means, what we want, what our governance should be going forward, I think has to be a fundamental part of this recovery. And then finally, in education, you know, Burdett suggests that we've advanced remote learning and online learning. I don't think there's any question about that, but I also think it has come with huge consequences. It may work very well in a higher education setting. I think we're finding it doesn't work at all the younger the children are. There are huge social, emotional benefits to gathering that may diminish as kids get a little older. They may be better suited for remote learning in some age limit, but boy, it is not universally a good idea. And we're finding, as Maureen said, you know, that most parents don't want to be teachers. They didn't choose that as their profession, and they are willing now, I think, in a way that they weren't maybe before, to pay teachers any amount of money. I mean, they're recognizing that this is a very difficult, very complicated, very important job, but they don't want to be the teacher and the parent and the home worker and the, you know, child care provider. So I think we're learning a lot about essential roles. We're learning a lot about education and at what levels, you know, and who in the professional life is well suited to remote learning and who really isn't, because there are clearly teachers who are struggling, who just can't flip a switch and say, okay, I'm going to do a Zoom classroom, and instead of being with my kids hands-on every day. So I think those are three really important conversations, not just to have here in Kansas, but hopefully at the federal level. Just a final, and this is a sort of wonky note, but it used to drive me crazy, so I'll just share it with all of you. There is a system of, you know, when you hear people in Congress talk about we need to pay for things that we're doing, we need to, that's all done by various budget groups in Washington, and it's done by actuaries who only, frankly, measure the spend. They never measure what happens if you don't spend. So preventive health care is worth nothing. Because in fact, the actuaries would tell you if you do preventive care, if you get cancer screenings, then you live longer and you spend more money in the health system in the long run. So it's actually a negative. We have to stop not only accounting for spending like that, but thinking like that. We have huge costs in this country to not spending our resources in a way that benefits the common good, in a way that puts us back in a fabric where we're all connected to one another, where there are expectations that if you live in this country, you should expect to have healthcare, to have education, to have a decent wage. And I'm afraid it ties back to this mentality that we've gotten into, where spending is something that we're very loath to do, and we never account for what we don't spend.
Questions from Wes or Maureen, or responses?
Well, there's nothing that I can disagree with. I guess my plea is for us to be mindful of how we all got here. And we have to acknowledge 1616 was slavery. We've had more time under slavery than African Americans have been free. There was the de facto, the killing, our diseases and whatnot, of the native population. And then you tack that on to, Dan Luton at Berkeley said this long ago, we came as a poor people to a seemingly empty land that was rich in resources. And we build our institutions for that perception of reality. Poor people, empty land, rich. Now we've become rich people in an increasingly poor land that's filling up. And those institutions don't hold. We patch them up, we give them a lick and a promise, but they don't hold. It's one of the best things I ever heard from anybody. That puts a perspective on the kind of problems that we're facing and what we must do as a practical necessity to make a journey towards something closer to the context which shaped us over those 200,000 years. Because what we've done is try to use one law or one moral imperative after another to help us behave. And yet the context is the problem. I have a friend and his wife that were killed by dogs in Georgia. They were killed by the pets of people of the neighborhood that never had a problem. But they got out one night, all of them, and they roamed the streets, and the two people, these two friends of mine, Will Darshvader, he used to be here in Salina, they suddenly became what they were in a context. And that was the context of a group of domesticated wolves. Now, I think context is what guides us. We're mammals too. And if we can get the context right, a whole bunch of these problems that we're trying to solve with laws or trying to solve with some moral code through the church or whatever, have a chance. But as long as we are in denial and playing out, and I think there's one other thing that's part of our problem. When the Royal Society was established in 1660, its motto, it was in Latin, trust no one, point of view. And then we also have, as part of our Christian heritage, after the crucifixion, Jesus dealing with Thomas. Thomas says, well, now I believe. And Jesus said, blessed are you for believing. Blessed are those who don't believe. So now we've got two things that work in our society. We've got the science and then just believe. Well, of course we need both. But when you start putting one over the other, rather than to think about what is our original relationship with the universe, that's all. And that doesn't compute for the usual kind of bills that get introduced or passed. This is nothing against those bills that get, well, some of them ought to not even have a chance to be written, of course, but you know, it seems to me until we take on this larger perspective and acknowledge the imperative of highly dense carbon that it has led us into, whether it's the industrial mind and the development of technological fundamentalism, then we're going to continue to keep on having these problems. And it took a long time for polio to get whipped. and it could take a long time for any number of the viruses in that general category to be dealt with. Well, anyway, there's more to be said.
I knew it would be difficult to close down a conversation with such different and different perspectives and important perspectives. But as Wes was talking, I was thinking about those differences. And one of the viewer questions is about all the shouting that we're hearing over those differences and the lack of collaboration among us in really working together, and that it dovetails, I think, with a lot of what we've heard from each of you. But this viewer question is, how can the average citizen make a difference and plug into this process and demand that leadership work for the common good when they hear so much of this shouting over these differences and these different perspectives? And I guess that could go to anyone, but the government.
Let me just touch briefly. I do think that it's a question of, to get back almost to the very beginning of discourse. And if you have discourse, it means you have to listen. And I think what individual people can do is start that conversation at a very low level. And I think that I can understand wanting to avoid politics in terms of your personal angst in this crisis, but honestly, it's hard to avoid politics, and I'm not sure, and I mean politics in a very broad sense, not necessarily partisan politics, but I think we have to have those conversations. You can start them in a neighborhood, you can start them in a church, you can start them in the city commission. We certainly are not very good at having them at the national legislative level right now. And I fear we're not as good at the state legislative level as we once were. But I think if you don't have the conversations and then have a voice like Wes, or voices that aren't necessarily always in the conversation, welcome them in. That's very tough, but I think you have to start having the conversation.
Yeah. Well, I agree with that, absolutely. And raising my 3 children, why, at the dinner table would come something like this. And so, Dr. Doom, what can we as ordinary citizens do about this? It was their way of allowing themselves to be excused from the table. Now, so the conversation, yes, but what is the quality of the conversation? Is it always the here and now? And rather than use your sense of oughtness to express the concern, and then eventually some good things change. And I think that, I mean, we have some evidence from our own work in developing agriculture based on the way the natural ecosystem works. I mean, we have on every continent now our work at work. We have, the Chinese have, like 12,000 acres of a perennial rice. You start with the sense of oughtness about saving the soils and reducing the chemicals. And then no matter what they've said to you from Stanford to Harvard over a 30-year period or 40, it doesn't matter. You get it out there and you begin to increase the imagination. That's why I'm calling for the more time spent on the long view. That's all.
I hate to interrupt, Wes, but we're going to have to close off here, and I want to thank everybody again. But on behalf of the First Presbyterian Church and the Solstice Series organizers, I'd like to thank each of you panelists, particularly for your participation and all that you have done and are doing to enhance the quality of life, not only in Kansas, but this country and the planet. A reminder to the viewers that you can continue to view any part of this series at the First Presbyterian Church website and on YouTube in case you missed the first 2 panels. Finally, a special thanks to the viewers for your willingness to engage with the ideas you've heard today and in the other panels, and perspectives that you might not have always been comfortable with or in agreement with your own, but which serve witness to the reality that we really do need each other to pull through this time, and to know that we truly are in this challenge together. So I want to thank you all, thank the panelists once again, and everyone stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.